Good evening and welcome to the League of Women Voters program, Voter Security, the Truth About Voting Lies. I'm Janet Lauer, Steering Committee Chair for the Falmouth League of Women Voters. A special thanks to FCTV Public Channel 6, FCTV.org, Roku, and Apple TV. Thanks to FCTV, this event is being broadcast live tonight and will be rebroadcast several times leading up to 48 hours before Election Day, November 5th. You can check FCTV's broadcast schedule on the station's bulletin board, FCTV website at fctv.org, and in the Falmouth Enterprise. A few words about the League. We're a nonpartisan political organization of women and men. We're nonpartisan because we never support a candidate or party. We're political to the extent that we do take positions on public policy issues, but only after studying the facts, discussing them, and forming a group consensus. We work to encourage active participation in government, to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and to influence public policy through education and advocacy. Discrimination or harassment of any kind will not be accepted within the League, including but not limited to race, socioeconomic status, age, ability status, religion, sexual orientation, national origin, gender identity, or marital status. The League is committed to fostering, cultivating, and preserving a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, access, and belonging for all people. The League is an organization that respects and values the richness of our community and our members. The collective sum of our individual differences and life experiences represents not only our culture, but our reputation and the organization's mission and achievements as well. In this election, it is of utmost importance that you feel assured that your ballot is securely cast and that it will be counted. Tonight, Town Clerk Michael Palmer will discuss voting by mail and at the polls. Larry Moore will then speak to the security of voting machines. He has done extensive research on this topic. We will take questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you. And we will start with Michael.
Is that on now? Okay. Good evening. My name is Michael Palmer. I live in East Falmouth with my wife, Marie. We have 5 adult children. I was first elected town clerk in 2003 and have been in that capacity ever since. A lot has changed, but one of my commitments I had made to the town when I ran was that we'd run and I would administer fair and accurate elections. And I think after 22 years, I think we've accomplished that. And so I have this statement up here, just how I believe that all the results, election results in the town of Falmouth have accurately reflected the will and the intent of the voters of Falmouth. So we'll get into it a little bit of, I want to cover 3 things. Let me get organized here. So I'm going to just cover our voting equipment, voting early, and the recount process. And I think Larry is going to discuss kind of a higher level of security with the voting equipment and what they do to get certified and whatever. But I'll just talk about what we do in Falmouth and what equipment we have in Falmouth. So in Falmouth, we use the Dominican ImageCast tabulator in each of our 9 precincts. Prior to each election, we are sent memory cards, and we install these memory cards into this tabulator. Prior to sending them out, and actually 4 days, at least 4 days prior to election, we have to test this equipment. So what we do in a test, well first it is something that I notify the town committee chairmans of when the time and date of when we're going to test them. It's also a public meeting and publicly posted and open to the public of when we do the test on this equipment. So what we do for the testing for this Dominican ImageCast tabulator is we take a block of 50 ballots, each ballot type. Say in this last primary there were Republican, Democrat, and Libertarian ballots. So 50 of each of those, and we make sure that every oval on the ballot is filled in, and then that we do some tricking of the ballots. I guess we overvote and we undervote to make sure that the machine is picking them all up. So we run the 50 ballots through this machine, And then we print a tape and we compare that against a hand-counted tally sheet to verify that the machine has accurately captured all the votes that are on the ballots. So, this is something that's added most recently, and this is a high-speed tabulator that we use to tabulate the early voting ballots. You know, back not too far long ago, it used to show up on your polling places. You used to get a ballot and you'd put it through the tabulator, and then the results would come out at the end of the night. But now with the onset of early voting in person and early voting by mail, we have been allowed to pre-tabulate these ballots prior to election, but the results stored on the laptop until election night when the polls close, and then we're able to consolidate those reports with the results that come back from each of the precinct tabulators to get the ultimate results from the elections. So this produces, and I think in 2016 was the first time we had early voting, and the majority of people in 2016 voted early in person. And there's almost a switch. We went through the 2020 where we had the COVID pandemic, and that kind of switched a little bit to more people voting by mail. To the last election, where we had 7,000 people voted total. Well, 4,000 people voted early, but only 230 voted in person. So we really have to, and we'll see after this next election, the data or what the mix is of the votes, because the amount of resources we put into having a polling place staff for 2 weeks prior to election, with the election workers that we have to staff there, don't warrant having 2 people come in a day. So I hope the legislature will look at the amount of hours that we will be required to open. But I get back into 2016 when we first had early voting in person and by mail actually, and we didn't have this high-speed tabulator. So we started tabulating on election day at 10 in the morning, and the ImageCast tabulator takes about 10 seconds per ballot. We didn't get done with the number of ballots we had till almost midnight. It was painful, it really was. And this will do about 100 ballots a minute. So it's obviously high-speed tabulator, so that's what we're using. This is tested in the same manner that we test the ImageCast tabulator. We run for each precinct, for each ballot type, we run the block of 50 ballots through the machine. We print out the results and we compare the results against the results from the tabulator, against the hand-counted tally sheets which come out of here. After these tests are done, we re-zero the machines and we print a zero report to show that the machines have been re-zeroed and we're not starting the election day with any votes already loaded into the machine. And each warden on election morning will do the exact same thing. They'll run a zero report. They will post that zero report on the polls at each polling place to show that the tabulators have been re-zeroed. The other equipment that is new in the last 10 years, this is, and everyone's voted recently, this is a poll pad. And rather than have paper in and out books, we were able to load all the database with all the election files onto these poll pads. They don't capture any vote. All they do is hold the database of registered voters in the town of Falmouth, and we use this to check people off as they come into each polling place. What this allows us to do is, in real time, it won't allow anybody to vote twice. So say we have 2 of these at each precinct. They communicate by a Bluetooth. Nothing on this equipment is connected to the internet. I wanted to just say that as we're moving around. But these do connect by Bluetooth, so you can't go on one line and then come back out and go on the other line and try to vote twice. The poll pads will say voter has already voted and they're not allowed to vote again. And likewise with early voting, we're using these to check in the early voting ballots. That gets updated every single night in our, on the poll pads, but in our state computer system. And then the poll pads are updated every single day. So if someone comes in on Tuesday, they can't come in on Friday. and try to vote again, because the poll pad's gonna say you already have voted. With the manual paper list, I don't know if that would be feasible to do. It'd just be a little bit of a nightmare to try to maintain those, the voting list, the paper voting list. Also, when we send these to the polling places, they are updated with the most recent voter files that show everyone that has voted early. And I think we cut it off on Friday night before the election, and then all early votings after Friday night, anything we receive over the weekend and on Monday or Tuesday until 8 o'clock have to get taken to the polls and processed, because the poll pads, we haven't been through a tabulator, the poll pads know that they haven't been recorded yet. These don't record any votes, they just make our job a lot easier, so. So again, early voting is one of the biggest changes in the last 10 years. And it really, I gave you some of the figures of how the dynamics of it have kind of changed. And we find that more people are voting by mail than in person, and in early voting in person and on election day. So it really has changed. But it also has really changed the workflow for town clerks across the state of Massachusetts. Where before, again, I used to worry about elections Monday night to make sure Tuesday everything ran right, and I didn't sleep much that Monday night. Now for about 2 months I don't get any sleep, because I worry about these mail-in ballots coming in, I worry about the people voting in person and make sure they're not voting twice. So it really does, I don't get any sleep, but it really requires a lot of effort on the staff of the town clerk's office to send these out and then receive them back and make sure we're recording them correctly, and then make sure they're getting into poll pads correctly, make sure they're getting in the state system so no one can vote twice. There's those safeguards in place. So I'm just going to go through the process of voting early by mail and just talk to you about some of these things. So everyone must be aware of these things. They're sent out by the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office, and they're sending out at the beginning of the year. You can check off that you want all ballots for the entire year. And and then you'll go into, we'll enter you into the state computer system, and then before every election, when we have the ballots, we don't have the ballots for November yet, so we haven't mailed them out. Probably won't until the beginning of October, because we just had the primary. But those are entered in, and if you hadn't signed up for one, you probably got like 3 or 4 or 5 of these, because before every election, they sent another one to everyone that hadn't signed up for one for the upcoming election. You got another one of these. So we get these are sent to, and this is my card. So this was sent to me. It's not randomly sent out. These are only sent out to registered voters in the town of Falmouth. And this one in particular is sent out to me. So if I wanted a ballot, I would sign this. Here's my signature. I'd send this back to the clerk's office. It's postage paid. We'd enter it into our state computer system. And then when we have the ballots, we need to, excuse me, I'm getting dry here. We need to address these. So another piece of equipment I was able to purchase, just in the last election, we sent out, I believe, 7,000 ballots by mail. So prior to this machine, which I'm going to tell you what it does, that 7,000 would have required 3 sets of labels on all the envelopes that go into a mailing. So that would have been, what, 21,000 labels somebody had to put on envelopes. It was just overwhelming. But this is a printer that addresses the envelopes. And the first one that would get addressed would be the outside envelope, which everything goes in that gets mailed. And that's what I have loaded up on there. You can see on the right-hand side of that printer. I do a mail merge. I go to this printer, I run the mail merge, and I can do 4,000, 5,000 in a morning, versus it would take a few days to put them together before. So in this packet that we mail out to you, there's obviously going to be a ballot, instructions, and an envelope that gets mailed back to you, along with an inner envelope that has to be matched up with this outer envelope. And here's, again, mine, and this envelope is addressed to mine. We're not sending them out to random people. We're sending them out to a registered voter that sent in your card. So the voter gets this, they vote it, they put it in the inner envelope. I'm losing all my pieces here. They put it, they seal it, they sign it. Again, there has to be a signature on here. If there's not a signature on this card or a signature on the inner ballot envelope, we will reject these and we will not process them. In the case of the outside envelope, we will reject it and send them another ballot saying you failed to sign the envelope. So that gets mailed out, and then they put it in the envelope, it gets mailed back to us. We have to open it, we date stamp them, we open them, and again, we put them through our poll pads, and then through the high-speed tabulator when we do the pre-tabulation. So there's a lot of extra steps versus, again, I call it when my father used to vote, he'd show up at a polling place, they'd give him a ballot, and he'd put it through the tabulator. Or probably he'd like push punch cards at that point, so they'd be hanging chads when he voted. But it's changed quite a bit, it really has. So there's the outside envelope, it's addressed to me. We get the card back, this card gets sent by the Secretary of the Commonwealth, I mail it back in, we address an envelope and mail it back out. We send this envelope's included, it has to match up with the outside envelope. It comes back in that envelope, has to be signed, and we're scanning. There's actually a barcode on this, and we can scan this into the state computer system. And then we hold it until we do the pre-tabulation, and then it needs to be checked, needs to be entered into the poll pads, and then run through the high-speed tabulator. So this is how we store them. Here's a list of everyone that returned their ballots, and this is in blocks of 50. So we store these in blocks of 50, and we check off to make sure we have all the envelopes for the people that returned their ballots. And then once we separate them, we keep the envelopes in this block, but then we have the ballots in this block, and we run these blocks through the tabulator, 50 at a time. So then all those results are accumulated until election night. 8 o'clock on election night, we get the results back from the precincts. We combine them, and then we can print out results. All right, so I thought I was missing a few steps here. Oh, I was going to talk about the recount before I got into that, but that's automatic voter registration I want to talk to you about too. So all this, we've done all this, and if somebody says, well, we don't know if those results are accurate. Well, we just had a recount for the state Senate district for Plymouth and Barnstable. And what we do is we actually had it in this room. And within a 24-hour period, I had 24 volunteers from all my election workers that did a great job. I had the staff from my office, phenomenal job. They came down, we organized it, we separated all the ballots, we counted them to verify that we had the correct number of ballots per each precinct, for each ballot type. In this case, we were counting the Republican state Senate race. We verified that we had all the correct ballots. And then we took all the ballots off the table and we brought back blocks of 50 and we counted them individually, one at a time. And the results came up. There was a change of 3 ballots. I'm getting really dry here, so sorry about that. There was a change of 3. One of the candidates picked up 2 votes and one picked up 1 vote. And there was one that was taken from a write-in. It was counted as a write-in. It went to one of the candidates. One was counted as a blank, and it went to one of the candidates. And what that difference would really be the intent of the voter when they voted. The machines won't necessarily capture that. So if on the ballot somebody put an X over by next to the name, or they put an X through one of the ovals that they filled in, but they filled in another oval, the machine wouldn't be able to capture that, but a human being would be able to look at that and see, oh, thank you, I appreciate that. Thank you. A human being would be able to capture that, and they would see that ballot, and they would determine what they felt the intent of the voter was, and then that's how they would record that. Now, each candidate would have observers to observe that process, and they would see that if they agreed with how the poll workers were counting that, then that was it. If they challenged it, they would bring it over to the Board of Registrars. The Board of Registrars would look at it and say, no, this is how we believe we should count that. If the candidate still disagreed with it, they would go back, and it would go back to the table that they were counting it, and it would be counted as the registrar of voters voted to count it, and then it would be brought back to the table, then they could challenge it in a court. So that would be the next step for that. So that's the recount process, and again, there was a change of 3 votes in this last election over, I think there were 2,000 people voted, I think there were 2,000 Republican votes voted, so a change of 3, which, and again, it was all from the intent of the voter. So anyway, we'll move on to automatic voter registration. I've got a lot of questions about automatic voter registration. That's when you go to the Registry of Motor Vehicles, and they're saying illegal aliens are getting driver's license and they're automatically voted. They're automatically being registered to vote. That is far from the truth. So when you go to the Registry of Motor Vehicles to update your license, you must provide the RMV with either a passport, a U.S. birth certificate, or U.S. naturalization papers, and if you don't, you will not be registered to vote. So if an illegal alien gets a driver's license, it's not being sent to us to register them to vote. In fact, if they go online and try to, now that they've got their driver's license, the online registering to vote, sorry, I'm really dry. The online registering won't allow them to do that either. So they would have to come in person and register to vote. So when they register to vote, they can check off U.S. citizen, over 18, fill it all out, but then they're either putting their driver's license down or the last 4 digits of their social security number. And if that would kick it out, if they don't have their driver's license said they're not a U.S. citizen, that would kick out that registration and not allow us to register them to vote. So the myth that illegal aliens are registered to vote, is that a myth? So, yes. Yes, I think that's how they want to do it. Yeah. So again, if we get back to, I think you wanted me to talk about what we do at the polling places. So at every polling place, we have a warden, a clerk, and we have 4 other inspectors, like we call them. So anybody that has a challenge or anybody has a question, and we also have a police officer that is there to keep the peace at the polling place. Anybody has a question with anything, or they're challenging something, they're saying it isn't right, they should always just talk to the warden. They can't interrupt the flow of an election or interrupt the voting process. But if they have an issue, they talk to the warden. I see we have a warden here. He's probably been talked to a couple times. So they're the only people that they should be communicating with, and hopefully that any issue they have will be resolved. If they can't resolve it, they obviously kick it up to me, and I come and we resolve it, but there is a police officer there also to keep the peace. So I don't know if you want to talk any more about that? Okay. So we got back to the statement I made at the very beginning that I have full confidence in the election results in the town of Falmouth. And I'm going to say the town of Falmouth because that's what's in my control. I don't know what they do in Georgia. I don't know what they do in Texas. I don't know what they do in Nebraska. I know what I do in the town of Falmouth. And I know the people that work as poll workers and the staff in my office, these election results reflect the will and the intent of the voters in Falmouth that vote, because a lot of people don't vote, and we missed that fact that in this last primary we had 22% turnout. I don't know, what's that, 78% of the people that didn't vote. So that's a bigger issue than registering to people to vote as far as I'm concerned. We can have registration drives and get people to register to vote, but if they actually don't vote, if you don't get the people that are already voted to vote, then you don't have a representation of the people and what they want to have happen. You have the people that come out and vote, and everyone has to live with it because that's how it is. So. All right, so I think Larry is going to talk about a higher level of certification of the election equipment, and then I guess we both can take questions. All right. I don't know if you need this or not. All those are mine.
Yours. I think this is mine. So a moment of
Just a piece.
Oh, thanks, yeah.
Do you want to transfer the microphone?
Oh, I have to turn it off. at least. So you want this one, or do you want to just use one of these handheld ones?
Let me use that just in case I want to wander around.
Okay, hold that a second. I got a snake through my shirt.
I got it.
Don't look anywhere.
Everyone's getting excited up here, so.
Can you see how to unclip it?
I may decide against this. So the first test was to come up with a provocative title. Show of hands, how many saw that and decided to come because of that? Okay, good. So my name is Larry Moore. I'm a resident of North Falmouth. And my wife is sitting here down front, and with her good friend Barbara Kanonopoulos, who I think probably everyone knows. And it's a pleasure to be here. About 3 or 4 months ago, I did I won't call it a practice talk in my home, but I had several people from the league come to our home and had me talk about sort of how voting systems work. We get a show and tell on the yeah. It is now.
Now it is.
How about that? Good. And so as a result, I was asked to do this, and I was happy to do it. And so let me start off with just a little bit of background on myself, because it's been an interesting odyssey for me. So in 2018, my company that I started in 2009, it's called the Ballot Group, and we were awarded federal certification for a brand new voting system. It was the first time in 15 years that a de novo, brand new, never seen before voting system had been certified in the United States. And by the way, there has not been another since. So it gives you some idea either of how difficult it is or how stupid people are trying to do this. And I think, probably both are a little bit true. So, but as I'm fond of saying, the government does not just let any new voting system come in to affect the peaceful transfer of power, nor should it. So, folks have asked me, what possessed you to do it? And the it was start a company in the teeth of the Great Recession in a tiny industry that was underfunded, where the customers were overworked and were bereft of modern technology. And so, where to start? Well, I had some good solid advice from a guy that became my mentor, who was this is now 2009 or 2009 really, was the Secretary of State in Florida. And he took me under his wing because I think I had a good PowerPoint. And without any evidence to disprove my claims, he believed what I was saying, and he said, why don't you try something out here? But he said, don't do a voting system because you'll lose your shirt. Instead, he said, try developing an audit system that would audit the existing voting systems and prove that they were accurate or not. And so that's what we did. But we achieved something along the way. And by the way, that little suggestion took 3 of us 3 years at 80 hours a week to do that audit system. So that was one of the, probably the most intense periods of my life, was working on that system. Incredibly, but incredibly rewarding. And so we achieved something that no one had done before, which was to develop a system that non-technical people could use that would do a 100% audit of a certified voting system, every ballot, across every concept, across every contest, and across every precinct. And to do that before the certification of the election was required. So I want to show you, because it's very hard to describe this, but I'm going to take about 20 seconds out and show you the system that is now being used in Maryland and has been since 2016, that is used statewide in Maryland. And here is a little snapshot of one of the reports that the system produces, and it's condensed. But over here you'll see that the voting system reported, which we call the comparison system, reported 98,042 votes for the primary in Maryland's largest county, Montgomery County. And the audit system counted exactly the same number of votes. But how do you know that? Those are just 2 numbers that happen to be the same on the ballot. And the trick was, how do you explain to a non-technical person that this number was exactly right? And I have posed that challenge to computer scientists, election officials, and people who are knowledgeable about elections. And no one has ever figured it out in a way that you can do this to verify the vote in a large election and know that the count was right in under 20 seconds. So let me show you how it's done. So imagine that we have, in this case, about 98,000 ovals. And let me bring that back. And next to Joe Biden's name on each one of these ballots, we electronically scissor out that oval and arrange it not in random order, but in descending order according to how much of the oval is filled in. And so the very last oval, and by the way, if you hover over that, I did, and now that I realize I made a mistake, I took out what was there, but it was said that this is the 98,042nd, if I recall correctly, vote, and all the others above it were more fully darkened. And if I clicked on that oval, I would see the full ballot and which box it was in and how far down in the box to count if I wanted to retrieve that ballot. And so this was a breakthrough in election transparency. And now in states that that use this, let me just get this going again. This is used nearly statewide in Florida. About, I think it's now 86% of the vote is audited with this system. And every single big county down in the bottom tier, Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, Hillsborough County, Pinell County, and many of the others are now using this system. In New York, it is 81% of the vote that's being counted, including New York City and all of the big counties surrounding New York, Suffolk, Winchester, Westchester, et cetera. In Maryland, as the example showed before, it is used statewide, as it is in South Carolina. So 100% of all the ballots cast are run through this system, and this visualization is available. And Maryland actually publishes this online, and it was at maryland.clearballot.com. And you can go look at those visualizations. So, but I'm here to talk about the challenges to voting system confidence. And I have seen over the years a real transformation in disinformation. It started out as disinformation, but I'll come up with a different name for it in a minute. So, the first thing I want to tell you is that voting systems don't just happen by themselves. There are published standards that the organization called the Election Assistance Commission creates. And these are detailed technical standards that every voting system that is federally certified has to meet 100% of, and it is a complete pass-fail. If you miss one criteria, you do not get certified. So when we presented our certification documents to the EAC, it took them maybe 6 months to go through this, which was just totally agonizing for us. And we gave them 4,000 pages of technical documentation in support of every single requirement that they levied in these two documents. And there were written down over 10,000 individual test cases, which said how would a third party, a test lab, test the system. And we had to do step by step 10,000 times how to test the system. So you can imagine that we were pretty pleased to get this certification. And there have been 2 companies that have tried since and not succeeded. And so, so the first thing I want to say is that to become a voting system is an extraordinarily rigorous process. Now, what happens when it becomes a voting system? And folks like Mike Palmer's organization guess it. Well, first of all, they don't get it from the vendor. The vendors are not, and Clear Ballot was a vendor, are not allowed to deliver the voting system directly to the county or the jurisdiction, the town of Falmouth in this case. It has to go from a test lab who does what's called in software a final build of the software. We take all the components of the software that we provide, and then we give them instructions as to how to put them together to create a gold disc, a certified voting system that they then deliver to, in Massachusetts' case, the Secretary of the Commonwealth, the Secretary of State, William Galvin, and then he delivers it to folks like Mike Palmer. So we do not, the vendors do not deliver final voting systems to the towns. There's an intermediate step. So, so here's just a tiny snapshot of the testing that is done. So first of all, remember that in 2020, there were about 155 million ballots cast nationwide. And so many have said that the election season, it used to be election day, it's now the election season, is like a military operation where about 100,000 precincts receive ballots on election day, but most these days, as Michael said, are actually done early and through the mail. And that imposes an enormous strain on the voting system progress. And as you probably have heard, early voting started, I think, was it sometime last week or the week before, and are now beginning to become early voting. But, I don't know if you've read this, but I'm going to go a little salacious here. Bear with me. But did anyone hear what happened in Montana with the military and overseas voting? Anyone hear about this? They sent out to military and overseas voters an electronic ballot that did not have Vice President Kamala Harris's name running for president. True story. And, you know, they said, whoops, we made a mistake. And I hope that the FBI comes and verifies that that was just a mistake, but it's hard to see how that was. So on Election Day and the weeks before it, an enormous number of ballots are received, processed, filled out, mailed in, tabulated, signature verification, and then tabulated. And so you can imagine how, I mean, does anybody ever, how many people run a computer in this? So like nearly everybody, right? Have you ever run across a problem? So you can imagine that what you do not want is voters coming in and having problems with the voting system. And it's doubly, or triply more important that people that have accessibility issues, that may be disabled, either for mobility, eyesight, or some other impairment, that they be able to vote independently and privately. And that is the law under the ADA Act, the Americans with Disability Act, that they be able to vote privately and independently. And that is a challenge. In fact, it is the biggest challenge to developing a voting system, to meet the requirements for accessibility. It is harder than all the others. And so usability means that people can come in and just know how to do it. And fortunately, we are educated as the public. We know how to fill in darkened ovals to indicate our preference. But as you saw in the little diagram, we've seen lots of ovals that are not filled in to have a machine assess voter intent. And that's what Michael was talking about. Either they circle an oval, there's a hand trimmer that will put a mark underneath the oval and miss it altogether. And that happens not frequently, but it's enough to be concerned about. And that's why there's this big process during a recount where we try to assess the true voter intent across all the ballots. What about accuracy? And I had a slide that I took out, but do you remember the iconic photograph of this guy? His name is Judge Rosenberg in Florida, in Broward County, who had this magnifying glass in front of a punch card ballot to try to, and what he's trying to do is to determine voter intent. And for all of you who saw the recount movie, you understand about it. Chads, dimple chads, pregnant chads, hanging chads, yeah, and the like. Well, those are all gone. But it was in that climate and in the memory of that I started Clear Ballot in Florida. And so almost all of the people that I dealt with had been through that searing experience that they never, ever wanted to happen again. And so the big concern was over accuracy at that time. And so as part of the testing criteria that the Election Assistance Commission in these documents that I flashed on the board a minute ago, the vendor has to deliver a test deck that contains enough ballots that are marked to equal 1.55 million marked ovals. And these are run through the tabulators that the voting system, that the vendor is getting certified on. And if you make one mistake, you're out. There can be no mistakes in assessing these marked ovals. Now, they don't mark them with circles around them, but they're fully darkened ovals, and you cannot make a mistake. So Mike Palmer has this system now. It's come to him in this Tinkers to Evers to Chance, vendor to state to Falmouth. And how do you know, how do the skeptical voters and citizens know that the system that is being run on Election Day is in fact the same system that was being tested? Well, there are and I'm not going to get into it unless there's deep interest in cryptography here in this audience. I'm guessing not. But there are cryptographic methods to determine that the system under test was the same system under use. And if a single byte or character is changed in the software, it will throw out a different verification code. And Mike Palmer, if he runs this validation test, can test that. But what about security? There's big issues about security. So security is a big topic. It starts with physical security, and I dare say that Mike locks his systems up. Doesn't just let them sit out for anyone to come along. That has happened, by the way. In the early days, in the 2000s, people brought in their systems. They kept them at home so they didn't have to travel back and they just took them home with them and then brought them to the polls the next day. Well, all that has disappeared. So that, we don't do that anymore. So it's physical security. But then there is security that in the inputs to the voting system. Remember Mike talked to you about the memory cards that he gets from the state? What's on those memory cards? Well, it is what's called the election definition. It is for each ballot style. And a ballot style is, how many, there's two in, yeah, so think of it, so you got a state rep in one part of Falmouth, and in another part you have a different, and so there's two, for the same office, there's two different candidates. And that's felt a lot in large counties in Florida. We saw Broward County has 4 congressional districts that run through it. And so voters, depending on their address, will get a different looking ballot, and that's called a ballot style. And so those memory cards cannot be tampered with without detection. And that's part of this cryptographic mechanism that is put into place that requires that when those memory cards are put into the system, there is a check done automatically that if you try to put in a bogus memory card, it will not let you do that. And that's an example of two, the physical security and the security of the memory cards. There are other techniques. There is something called the election definition, which is a formula that for any random collection of ballots, including the full count of ballots, has to meet, when you tally it up, there's a formula that you can run on the votes that will produce a number that says this is how many ballots you've got in your hand. You can add up the votes and the undervotes and the overvotes and apply this formula, and that formula will yield the number of ballots that are cast. And so that's another little check. And so the final thing I want to talk about is durability. So now on election day, you're going to have, or the election season, you're going to have all these people show up on election day to cast their ballot. And if anything goes wrong, guaranteed all hell will break loose. And so the systems are tested for in a heat chamber for a week where temperatures go up and down to about 120 degrees Fahrenheit, down to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And they cycle. And that is one of the most rigorous physical tests that these systems go for. And a lot failed. Ours failed on the first test, by the way. And so we had to wait another 3 months, another 2 months, and then we could test again. So that was, another one is if the power goes out. So all the systems have battery backups. And so they'll run, I think it's 2 hours on battery backups. And then there's a backup system of ballots that get filled out and put into a secure compartment of the Dominion voting system. I think that's called door 3. So that's another example of just a few testing. So I want to, so at the end of the 2000 election up through the 16 election, the big concern was about voting system security and accuracy. And then things began to morph. And now we have, and I started off by saying, you know, what is the future of disinformation? Well, it's really not disinformation anymore. It's called, I call it, and others call it, election subversion. Election subversion is a catch-all for anything that causes an election to go awry, a voter not being able to reach the polls, cast their ballot freely and fairly, and have that ballot counted, and also not intimidated or threatened or, or otherwise harmed. And so what we're seeing now is a raft of election subversion techniques. And they start with gerrymandering, which originated in this state by, it was a guy named Geary, but Geary was morphed into Jerry. And gerrymandering, of course, is where the voters don't pick their representatives. The representatives pick the voters. And that's been made very easy by sophisticated mapping software combined with census data and voting data that lets people who want to gerrymander carve up and create these strange districts. There's one in Florida that goes from the northeast corner, Duval County, all the way 200 miles to the west to a little neighborhood in Leon County. And it looks like a stingray. And the path that it goes along is 30 feet on either side of I-10. And then it picks up a little neighborhood, and that is the district of Duval County, of that county. And so this is pernicious. And it is why we see non-contested elections where only one party votes. And there's a big effort that's being headed by former Attorney General Eric Holder to try to correct gerrymandering and to do away with it. There's voter suppression, which is what we hear about when voters are denied access to the ballots, either by legislation or by changes to laws right before the election, where polling places are closed, or disinformation is sent out, and that says, you know, Democrats vote on Tuesday, Republicans vote on Monday, or vice versa. And election denialism, I think we're all aware of that, but that is another pernicious form of election subversion. And then there is, regrettably, physical intimidation. And this is horrible. So, and by the way, the league, you know, your National League of Women's Voters, have signed on to several lawsuits to challenge voter intimidation. One such event occurred in Arizona, where armed people were standing next to drop boxes. These are not mailboxes, but drop boxes, where voters would come and put their ballots, and they were just physically intimidating. That asked, you know, someone would ask for IDs, as if you needed one, and then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a little bit about AI impersonation, and that was the case in New Hampshire not too long ago, when Joe Biden's voice was impersonated and 200 robocalls went out with his voice saying, you know, I got you, you don't need to, you know, worry about voting. So, so that is a little bit about election subversion. So what can we do? First of all, when I started off Clear Ballot, I was excited about being able to prove that our competitors' voting systems were not accurate. And I am here to tell you that I failed in that endeavor, completely failed. Voting systems certified by the federal government are incredibly accurate. They are secure, and your election officials, and you know, I was filled with conspiracy theorist, I was familiar with conspiracy theorist rhetoric in the 2008-2009 period when I was getting going. And many of the targets of that disinformation were election officials as being nefarious, dishonest, and can't wait to elect the guy that they want. That is bogus. I have been all over the United States, and election officials, almost without fail, are honest, hardworking, overworked, and certainly underpaid. So the first thing I think is your default should be to trust your election officials. You should also vote against election deniers. Now, we don't have a lot in this state, but there are some. But those people should not be in power. They should not have enjoyed the freedom of people to vote and then abuse that by denying what the voters said, voted. So I would say vote against election deniers. When you get into discussions, beware of what is called the Gish Gallop. The Gish Gallop is a term that was coined for conversations where one party spews one rapid-fire lie after another and makes arguments that I liken to water on a plate. You just can't nail things down. You know, whenever you make one argument, it shifts over here to another. So I would say also beware of allegations that just sound like election denialism. And then at events like this, hopefully, is to stay informed, to talk to one another, to talk to your friends, and but trust trust your election officials. And that, as my mom said, is the end of the teddy bear story.
Okay, we're ready for questions, and we will have one of our, Bruce will have the microphone, and talk into the microphone when you have a question. Anyone? Yes. Wait a minute. Oh, do you have?
The microphone.
Oh, here.
Is that one working?
There we go. Oh, you don't want to know what
Yeah, I got one on.
Question for Larry. I'm worrying now about Montana and those missing.
They were corrected.
They were corrected,
Yeah.
so how did they do that? Do another?
Well, first of all, they went out as
sent
electronic ballots.
So they
not
could be
physical
sent
ballot.
another ballot then?
Yeah, they just notified, no one was allowed to cast that, to have that ballot count,
Oh, good.
obviously. And it was found in the same day.
Okay.
But the fact of the matter, it went out to all the military and overseas voters at once.
Okay. So I don't need to worry anymore.
Not about not about that.
Gentleman in the back there.
Good evening. Thanks for the presentation. That was fantastic. We used to have a saying. I worked for over 15 years in the biopharmaceutical industry related to validation. And the final few years, it was basically my focus was computerized system validation, as well as with a strong emphasis on data integrity. And the saying in the industry was trust but verify. And the verification that was necessary was documented evidence. That evidence that demonstrated that the system was valid and that the data was integral. It was trustworthy. And that was based upon qualified equipment as well as trained personnel with a defined life cycle for the data. So I guess I have a few questions. One
Oh, you're
related.
speaking my language here.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it was good to see that there are validation requirements. The voluntary voting system guidelines, I guess, provide those specifications. You know, one of the areas of focus was risk assessments. In my experience, one of the major places where all the risk was assumed, or there was a high level of risk, was usually the people. It was the people filling out the ballots, and it was the people that had access to the data. So the segregation of responsibilities, is that something that's within the validation protocols that's tested? So, you know, the equipment typically would be qualified by a manufacturer. And then when it's delivered to, say, the locality, it would be then, you know, implemented locally. Those local procedures then would be challenged with trained personnel in that local environment. And that would be the validation that would be performed. So
I think there are
related-
quite a few people with questions, so if you want to get to your question, that'd be great.
Well, the question, I guess one quick one would be, you indicated that it was a myth to think that the registration of motor vehicles, that there was any issues related to voter registration, the automated voter registration process. Do you have any evidence that demonstrates that? Does the Registry of Motor Vehicles validate that process from start to finish?
I don't particularly have it, but I just
Okay.
came from a conference with the Secretary of the Commonwealth's Legal Division, and she expounded upon that and said that if there are instances they are investigating and that they're confident that that is happening, that those people that are not supposed to be registered to vote are not being allowed to vote unless they have documentation that they are, and it's documentation is attached to their record that we verify that gets sent to the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office if they want verification of U.S. citizenship, either a passport or naturalization papers or a U.S. birth certificate.
By the way, that license that allows you to vote is called a real ID. Is that a term you're familiar with?
It is.
And so if you don't have one, you can't do at least two things. One is to vote, and the other is to fly commercially.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not necessarily focused on the equipment or the credentials. I'm focused on the people that are involved in the process. That's typically where the risk is located. The people that have access to information, that have an incentive to change information, to modify electronic records or data for their own purposes. And it's great to say trust public officials, but our saying in the industry was trust but verify. There should be evidence that demonstrates that an independent party has validated that process.
There may be that evidence available. I do not have it with me tonight, but there
Okay.
may be, there has to be a validation process going on continuously.
Sure, and that validation process would be reflective of data integrity. So that would be the evidence that demonstrates that it's not a myth. So the emphasis is not to say it's not a myth, but to provide the evidence that shows that this is trustworthy data. And here's the
I get
proof
it,
that
a lot, and
demonstrates.
I'm gonna get to you again. There's a lot of people with questions, so I'm gonna ask you to get to a question.
So the question is, you don't have any evidence that demonstrates that it's a myth?
I don't have any,
neither do I.
I don't have it
Thank
either
you.
way, so we don't have that.
Our kin is voting systems, not voter registration systems.
Right, but that, again, goes back to the areas of risk where, the system that you have created, I think, demonstrates that voters potentially are not trained effectively in order to fill out the ballots. It doesn't necessarily validate the election process.
Okay, so I guess we get it that you don't feel it's been validated yet. We don't have that evidence for you, so let's.
Thank you.
If you have other questions, let's
So,
move on.
so the validation evidence is what I was looking for in order to,
And we don't have that,
Okay.
but it may be available somewhere.
thank you.
All right.
It may be available
Yeah.
when?
Next question.
Prior to the election, or?
You can talk to the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office and find out whether that's been validated. That's not something I do. I don't have any validation whether it happened or it didn't happen. The Secretary of the
I'll
Commonwealth.
be happy to have this discussion after the,
I think Paul had a question here.
Thank you both for the enlightening presentations. When I was in elementary school and had our first opportunity to understand civics, we were talked about the virtue of the Australian ballot and the secret ballot. So that raises two things in my mind, one of which just came recently, where someone was talking about voting here in Falmouth, in which when they ran the ballot through the tabulator, the person standing next to the machine could see the party registration because it was in clear color, red or blue on it. So I'm an advocate now of ensuring that voters, when they go to the polls, know that the tabulators will read the ballot upside down so that you can preserve the privacy, the Australian ballot. Notice
that is one of the tests that they routinely perform during certification.
I think we could do a better job of
all
informing.
orientations.
And I've worked as an election
So
person.
Paul, just a quick, how people vote is private. What party they are in is not private. That's available to anybody that asks.
Right. But if it's face up, you can see the vote as well as the party. The second one is a question, and that is that we hear frequently about the risks associated with ballot harvesting, and the risk that I understand it, and I'd love to get both of your reactions to it, is that in the case of a ballot harvester, someone who's collecting ballots and then submitting them on behalf of others, could be selective in which ballots get submitted and which ones do not. And a ballot that never reaches our system can never be validated. It's outside of the system. So I'd love to hear your comments on ballot harvesting.
Well, I don't know what I actually do not know what the law is in Massachusetts on that. Do you recall? I mean, basically, ballot harvesting is the term used when ballots are aggregated into a person or an organization to carry to the polling locations or to the jurisdiction, and the archetypical example of that is in assisted living centers, where the people in the center do not have the mobility to bring the ballot to the polling location. And so people, and there was a famous case in North Carolina where they were harvesting ballots from people and then changing the vote. And so that was, and that is a felony. So organizations that are either licensed to do this for assisted living facilities, or it's just illegal altogether, is really a statewide law, either to allow it or to prevent it. And if to allow it, to nail down what the requirements are for the collection and the presentation of those ballots.
So in my experience, again, and I kind of talked about it a little bit in my presentation, with those applications are sent to an individual voter. That individual voter sends it back to us. We send to an individual voter, address that address. So if that individual voter is giving it to a person collecting ballots and harvesting them, they've created the fraud. And I don't have evidence that that's happening here in Falmouth. So.
I live in Mashpee, but I was watching a recent Mashpee Selectmen's meeting online, and there was a group of people there called Sovereign Citizens, maybe? Yes. And they were alleging, they were from different towns, 2 from Falmouth, 1 from Osterville, 1 from Bourne, and the last one was from Mashpee, alleging voter fraud and all these things from the 2022 election. It's going to happen again, and I just wanted to brush it off, but I wonder if you've heard of them, or what are your thoughts on them?
I definitely have heard of them.
I've heard of them also.
What's that?
I have also heard of them, yes.
Yeah, and there are others. There's True the Vote. They're big, especially down south, and I've run across them. And to me, they are all of the same ilk, which is to try to find some way of casting doubt on the way we run elections in the United States.
So I've asked a group, and I'm not sure if it is this particular one, to come and talk to me and bring their concerns, and I'll address each one of their concerns individually, and we can talk about it that way. But they're looking for a platform for the select board's meeting, that the select board don't necessarily have the answers that they're looking for. And I don't think they're probably part of a public comment section, so the select board isn't even commenting, but the select board wouldn't have the expertise to be able to answer their concerns. Now, I have, again, asked the people that have addressed some of these concerns with me, and they said, we have a bunch of questions. I said, well, let's set up a time, you come in and talk to me. I did set up a time with somebody to come in, and they had another commitment, they couldn't come in and talk to me.
I
My
would
question
further
also
opine that
is,
they're not interested in answers.
another question about these people is, do they have the potential to show up outside polling places and intimidate voters?
150 feet away from the polling place, and we have police officers to keep the peace. That's, I guess, First Amendment rights or Second Amendment rights. They have their right to be there, just not intimidating in terms of being right at the polling places, not allowing people to go in the door.
Thank you.
Up here.
Does Falmouth have a protocol to facilitate a homeless person in Falmouth?
A
Yeah,
homeless
voting?
person?
Yeah.
They would need to register to vote at an address that is available to them.
But if
whether-
they're homeless,
Yep, so they're gonna have to identify a address where they most, reside most of the time, whether it's a park bench, and then they can have an address right next door to that park bench. I mean, I don't know what this park bench is, an address to every,
but is there an outreach to these people? I mean,
we don't outreach to people that registered them to vote. I know that Human Services obviously outreaches to homeless people all the time.
okay. Thank you.
In the back
In the
there.
back?
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about someone who perhaps didn't respond to their street census thing, so they're voted for many years, but then they're not registered at the moment? What happens with their vote?
Okay, so yearly we send out a census, a town census form. Not to be confused with the US Census, which is every 10 years. So we send it out to every registered voter in the town, and if they don't return that, then they become an inactive voter. As an inactive voter, when they show up at the polling place, they need to show identification that they have resided continuously at the address they say they're registered to vote at. And if they can show identification that proves that they're there, then they are allowed to vote, and then they actually would become an active voter at that point. So if somebody, for example, and I always use the example, if somebody moves to Alaska and doesn't tell us, and Alaska doesn't tell us, so they never return their census. So after 4 years, we can remove them from the voting list, and we would send a final notice of removal to their last address. So and then people would get notification that they've been removed. But that's the only way you'd get removed. If you haven't voted or done some other activity, or signed a petition, signed nomination papers, if you haven't done something that shows you're still residing at the address you're registered to vote, then after 4 years, 2 November elections, you would be, and every year you would you'd get the yearly census, but then we send a confirmation card saying, are you still there or are you not still there? And the post office should be forwarding those. So if you moved and you left an address in Alaska for it to be forwarded to, they would get it there. They can return that to us and say, no, I'm no longer living in Falmouth, I'm living in Alaska. And then we would be allowed, with their signature, to remove them from the voting list.
Is that just a question of the audience? Has anyone heard of ERIC, E-R-I-C? It stands for the Electronic Registration Information Center, and it is a nonprofit organization that collects from its member states voter registration data, and then they harmonize it so that they can find people who vote in 2 states. And since the 2020 election, they have begun to lose states, mostly in the South, that create excuses for not to participate in it, which basically means that people could vote twice and not be detected. But it's been a pretty effective mechanism for the participating states to detect voter fraud.
So in Massachusetts, the Secretary of Commonwealth's office would receive through their database, somebody that registered to vote or gave their last address as Massachusetts. Say they moved to Florida and they gave their last address as Massachusetts. And the members of the people, I don't know if it's Eric or that may be a private thing, the member states that are involved in exchanging information such as this would then send the address where they registered to vote in Florida, for example. If it was Massachusetts, Florida would send Massachusetts Secretary of Commonwealth documentation that they registered to vote in Falmouth, and that would filter down to the towns. But not every state is involved in that system, so that makes it a challenge to be 100% that your voting list is it really would impact turnout. There's a 2 or 3% that are never going to ever vote here again, so it really skews what the turnout percentage is, because you have those people that are on the books that will never vote here and they've moved somewhere else. Anybody else? This gentleman right here?
Thank you. On election day, when an individual walks into their precinct and is ready to vote, what type of identification is required as you step up to the desk?
Identification isn't required in the state of Massachusetts to vote. You need to state your address and your name, and you'll be checked off the voting list.
So is there ever an issue where people walk in without identification and use,
You don't ask for identification, so
Right, but-
90% of the people walk in with it.
they give an address, may not be their own address? Is that ever an issue?
Where, could it be? Yes, I guess, but you'd have to know that. I mean, I don't know how you would determine if they're giving you a false address. Sure, there's always a degree of error in everything, so.
But to that point, because I work at the polls, the address and the person's name have to coordinate, and if they don't, then there is an issue.
So the person who's voting using somebody else's name and somebody else's address is the person creating fraud.
And in general, that's a felony.
Yeah. Back there.
There was a process that I heard about called curing the vote in Florida, and I think that was an opportunity to correct some mistake that was found in a vote. Does that still exist using your system, Larry? And
Well-
do we have such a thing in Massachusetts?
So curing occurs when the voter goes to, for example, in a state that does require voter identification, or their name is not in the poll pad, and they're allowed to cast a provisional ballot. And that provisional ballot is not counted until it is cured. And the curing process is that the voter is notified that their ballot is not, he's reminded that their voter's not, he knows it's not counted, going to be counted, but he's reminded that it's not being counted, and he has a certain number of days to come in and present identification, and that's called curing.
So we would get a provisional ballot, and the person would say, maybe I registered to vote at the RMV, how come I'm not on the voting list, or I'm not on the voting list, or maybe you haven't voted in 4 years. But we would get that information back, or maybe they have moved and they didn't register to vote somewhere else. So we would get that provisional ballot back at the clerk's office, and then the next day after the election, we would do the research to determine, look up his voting records and see what the voting record actually said. If it says he moved and we'd have an address where he moved to, then we wouldn't count that. If we went, and in particular, we had a provisional ballot in this last primary. Somebody went in and they were said they were registered as a Democrat, and they said, I have never been registered as a Democrat. So we allowed that person to vote by provisional ballot. When the ballot came back to our office, we pulled their registration card, and indeed they did check off unenrolled. So what had happened is when they were entered into the system and registered to vote, there was an error. We counted that ballot as cast. With the RMV, if someone says they went to an RMV and registered to vote, we have a way to contact the Registry of Motor Vehicles. They will do the research at their end and send us back either verification that they did register at a particular RMV or they didn't register at a particular RMV. We also have the capability to do statewide searches to see if someone else in the state, not in other states, but in the state, happen to be registered in another town, and they just wanted to be convenient to vote where they were at the time. Up front here?
Barbara? Wait, hold on one second. No.
I wonder if either of you have some thoughts about why we have such a low turnout and whether or not anything could be done in the voting process to raise that, apart from making voting, non-voting illegal.
We need
When
candidates
this-
on the ballot that people will come and vote for.
When this gentleman said the words Australian ballot, it was at the point of Australian that I thought he was going to say mandatory voting. because Australia has that. And I don't know other countries, but they have a minor fine. It's like $20. And, but they achieve above 90% turnout. And so there's the Ash Institute at Harvard is championing mandatory voting. I happen to be a big fan of trying to make progress on voting remotely by your phone. And we're not there yet. There's a lot of things to be concerned about, but I think the state we're in now, where there is nothing being done, is not a good thing.
I think just what we've developed from early voting is that people have other choices of how to vote. Now they don't have to go to the polling place. They can come and vote early, 2 weeks before an election. They can vote by mail. That has an increased turnout. It only changed the method of people have voted. Somebody that would normally have always gone to the polling places may now always be registering to vote, or maybe voting by mail, not registering to vote, voting by mail. But again, we look at this last primary, there were uncontested races. There were races with nobody on the ballot. The whole Libertarian ballot had no people on it. So how would Libertarian people come out to vote with no candidates to vote for? So we need better candidates that aren't going to be dissuaded not to vote because of the scrutiny you go through in the election process. So there's a lot of issues that could help. I mean, but I think we start with great candidates. That would be great.
Thank you for a very thoughtful presentation. I'm curious, I just lost the train of thought here, and there were no survivors. I'll pass it to the next person.
Welcome to my club.
I'll be more brief this time, so I apologize. Took me a while to get out my my thoughts as well, but you know, based on some of the discussions, 2 items related to fraud were identified: ballot harvesting and the potential voter that will commit the fraud at the poll itself. You know, those 2 areas then would be, you know, say related to risk. And in terms of validating a process, an election process, it would be putting in place controls and then ensuring through testing that those controls are effective to mitigate that fraud. And it doesn't seem as though there's any potential controls being implemented besides honor code and potential punitive after the fact through fines or felony or jail time. You know, I was just wondering what your thoughts were related to potential areas of fraud and how to mitigate that. Because, you know, quite honestly, I think manual voting is trustworthy. I would have full confidence in Mr. Palmer and Larry to take account in this room and make sure that it's accurate and the data is integral. However,
I'm very tired. I may add things up incorrectly. So that's
well,
why we have voting machines to add.
Right, but look at all the witnesses. So that's what the check is. Related to electronic systems, that's where I find the flaw. And having worked in that in an industry that spent millions, if not billions, of dollars to implement systems that were validated to mitigate fraud in the biopharmaceutical realm, you know, that's what's done. They implement controls and they validate those controls to make sure that the fraud is eliminated or at least mitigated to an extent where we can trust the data.
Right here. Oh, sorry.
I want to test your memory, Michael, on voter turnout in 2016, 2020. What was the percentage of voter turnout?
Presidential election?
Yeah.
I'm thinking it was into the 80% for a presidential election.
Okay.
I don't
So
have the
there's
exact
hope
figures.
for a good turnout.
Well, I guess at the presidential election, people come out to vote, but in a local election, you get 15 to 25%, which is, you know, you can call up your board of selectmen who are spending your town meeting members who are spending all your real estate tax dollars and say, I don't like what you're doing. You're never going to call the president of the United States and get him to make a comment. Well, I haven't got an answer yet, so I don't know. So right over here. Woman right there, the second on the.
Sorry.
Did you have a question? I'm sorry. Yeah, I thought you had your hand raised. Anybody else?
And it's just related to voter turnout and you know, Larry's good work with that system. It I think identified a place of concern, and that is the training of the voter and the education of the voter, not only to be prepared in order to vote, but to do it properly, and that would mitigate a lot of the, say, you know, at least some of the risks.
It's not a huge number, and it only comes into play when there's a very tight election. And then it's very important to assess voter intent. But I think, you know, those words sound nice, and I grant that. However, a lot of the people who miss the vote, they know how to vote, and they know how they should vote. But at the time when it comes, they either have an eyesight problem, they have a hand tremor, and that's not something that education is going to cure. And so what we then have to talk about is building resilience into the system to find those efficiently and cure, using that term synonymous, you know, same term with the other one, but to basically help the voters' intent be surfaced at the time of the recount efficiently. And that's what this oval visualization does. And the state of Florida, many counties are using the system that we certified in Florida, which is an audit system, not a voting system. But they're using it to produce the final count because it is so fast to determine true and voter intent. So that's. Yeah. We could go a long time on that, and I think we would come to violent agreement on that topic.
We're just going to have a few words from our co-chair of our voter service, Gina Mapp. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Gina Mapp, board member and co-chair for the Voter Service Committee. On behalf of my co-chair, Felicia Broderick, in her absence, and our committee members, we thank you for joining in person and virtually. We are grateful for our FCTV partners, Bob and his team, our league liaison, Lynn, for tonight's broadcast. Thank you to Larry and to our esteemed and dedicated clerk, Mike Palmer, for their presentation. Mike has been very supportive in providing access to us for programs like Candidates Night. So hence my pitch. We hope to see all of you at Candidates Night Wednesday, October 16th at Falmouth High School. There will be an opportunity to meet and mingle with our candidates at 6:30, and the program will start at 7 p.m. The candidates attending are Representative David Vieira, Kathy Fox Alfano, Representative Dylan Fernandez, and Matthew Mortori, Senator William Bill Keating, Dan Sullivan, and Thomas Smokley. We hope that you will be able to join us. If you need assistance with voter registration, please pick up one of our QR code cards or a paper application and check out the voter's guide. All are available to you this evening. Finally, we invite you to submit questions to the League's website, and remember that all questions must be addressed to both candidates. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Okay. Thank you, and remember to vote.